Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to Drafting Dangerous. And today's video perhaps starts on a stranger premise. I want to go ahead and demo 3 different designs for you that I think each illustrate a principle of pattern manipulation that is not immediately obvious. So while someone like me who has been drafting for a while can take a look at these designs and immediately know what to do, I think that X-ray vision has been dialed in and I want to help you get to that same place. So with 3 different designs to get into, let's go ahead and dive on in. And we will begin with this design that I had submitted as a demonstration request over on Instagram. And although this is undated, I would expect this is a late 1930s or possibly very early 1940s design. And if we're looking at this style, you can't see any visible darts. All of the darts have been eliminated. You may be inclined to think, oh, that's just a weird princess seam, and they have thrown the fit fullness, the dart degree fullness, into that style line. But the reason I'm choosing to demonstrate this design is because this is representative of a style line that is only there for style reasons. This is not a true princess seam, not because it goes from the neckline to the side like this, but because it does not actually control the fit. And we can know that because it does not pass over and through the apex, which will have been obvious to some of you, but not everyone, because we're all at different stages in our pattern drafting and design analysis journey. So I have a tracing of my basic bodice block front here, and the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and tip up the neckline. As you can see here on the design, this has a bit of what I like to call a grown-on stand collar. It's just where the neckline comes up and kind of hugs the side of the neck, as opposed to just being right at the, join between the neck and the shoulder. And I have covered this style of neckline slash collar quite a lot, especially over the last few years here on the channel, so I can link up to a video in a card where I show this in a more step-by-step way. But as it's not the reason I am demonstrating this design today, I didn't want to focus too much on it. And yes, don't worry, that was Oliver walking by. He was nearby for these demonstrations today, and he will pop in from time to time. And to give myself a smooth midriff to work with, I'm actually going to close my waist dart and throw that fullness into the side dart for now, just so I have all 52 degrees of my personal dart fullness sitting in the side, which will give me this clean, smooth midriff section to be able to design the style line with. And I can try and mimic this style line from the late 30s here. Comes down from the neckline, kind of swoops a little bit along that front neckline and then underneath the bust here. But I will go ahead and cut that apart. So again, that is just a style line. If I sewed it back together, nothing about the fit changes. This style line does not create the cone. The cone is still going to be created by dart fullness. We are going to move that dart fullness into the gathered sections below the bust, but we haven't done that yet. But I have to add seam allowance to both sides of this style line so that I can sew it back together later. And I have demonstrated other styles in the past that work this same way, where there are style lines, but they are not there for fit reasons. So I'll try and link a few of those in the description. But of course, as usual, I've forgotten to mark notches before I cut it apart. So let me go ahead and do that now. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and split this dart fullness into 3 darts below the bust here. I'm trying to concentrate the gathering in the same spot as the vintage style, which is mostly not, you can see that the pull lines for the gathering aren't pulling from the center where the buttons are. They're really focused underneath the bust section, like a 3 or 4 inch section right below the fullest part of the bust. So that's where I'm trying to concentrate my gathering as well. And I have these little tiny darts in here, but that's still 52 degrees of fullness. It just doesn't have very far to travel, so it doesn't open up very wide, or at least not to our eyes. But if I were to measure the amount of fullness I just added in beneath the apex, it would still be that same 52 degrees that I always have going on for my personal fit. But now that I've opened that up, I will tape on some more extra paper, and I can draw in the seam allowance for this section as well. So again, that it can be set back into the center front piece. It just has a little bit of extra stuff going on underneath the bust now, and that will all be gathered down and will create the same cone of fit as the dart fullness always does. We're just going to be controlling it via gathering this time. And the style line does not actually create the fit, even if it does facilitate us being able to fit the garment with this gathering. So this will gather down like so. I can match up my notches and we'll be able to sew these pieces back together. And I'll just tape down some more of my floops here. And yes, the cats are jumping around the bedroom in the background, so if you hear that, apologies. And then I remembered, oh, I'm going to need some front of this for the buttons, which of course I'm not going to sew in a dozen buttonholes and buttons today on this mock-up, but just to give you an idea of how this would overlap in the front, I will add an inch along the center front here and just smooth that off into the curve of the neckline. Of course, a design like this is a good opportunity to color block or texture block. You could add like a sheer overlay to one section and not the other, for example. So sometimes a style line is only there to allow for color blocking or texture blocking, or just for visual interest when you're up close looking at a garment. I'll go ahead and cut this out of some steel blue quilting cotton today. I believe this is Kona cotton. I'm not sure the exact shade. I bought this ages and ages ago to make mock-ups for the book that never happened. So here I am still using this fabric to make mock-ups for Drafting Dangerous, but instead of there being a physical book called Drafting Dangerous, I'm here, unsurprisingly, making videos instead. But I will transfer those notches onto the fabric as well, this time in a silver gel pen, a rather useful gel pen to keep in the sewing room, I find. And now my radiators are clicking in the background. Always a different ASMR experience for those of you using nice headphones. But I will mark the notches on the, I guess, side front bust piece as well. Looks rather silly, but that's alright. This is not a style I would ever think to do on myself, just because sometimes gathering underneath the bust, the cone created is the same, so the fit is fine. It's just for me personally, stylistically, I don't love gathering beneath the bust because I feel like it lowers the bust visually almost and is a little bit matronly looking on me because I happen to be a busty person. So I have a lot of gathering to put in there, you know? I of course have my own opinions on different designs, being a designer, first and a pattern maker second, I suppose. But fashion design, like all art, is at that point subjective. So while I feel confident telling you how to do a thing, whether or not to do it is entirely up to you. And I did recently have a question about why we extend the indications for where the gathering stitching begins and ends beyond the original placement of the darts. And that's because when we have a dart, when we fold that closed, everything disappears into a single point, a single line. Whereas with gathering, you can't make gathering gather down to a single point any longer. So you have to extend that gathering along the seam line further because, of course, you can't gather 2 inches of fabric down into a single line. It has to sit somewhere. There's too much fullness. And if you wanted the fabric to disappear, that's why you would use a dart, but the gathering itself has to be distributed further. Though I find describing this particular principle difficult, and also describing how far out to extend your gathering stitching compared to where you want the gathering to sit, also kind of hard to explain. In my opinion, you can't really extend the gathering lines too much because you can always move your gathering along them to where you exactly want it. And I did cut out just my basic block back with the same neckline modification, which does involve a little bit of a tip out of the center back, so this will have a center back seam as well, just so that I can model this mock-up for you in the end. And I did make a facing as well for that same reason, just so I can finish up the neckline of this and give you a good idea of what the style would look like when put together in a slightly thicker cotton, because quilting cotton is not the best fabric necessarily for apparel sewing. Which the thickness of the quilting cotton doesn't bother me as much as how it looks after a couple of washes. Because I always think that quilting cotton, especially in darker colors, starts to get that little bit of a faded, worn quilt look, which is not bad in a quilt, but isn't great for a dress. Anyhow, before I can assemble this style line, for each side I do need to tie off one side of my gathering stitching, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just pulling all the threads to the side that I'm working on. Of course, the only problem with Kona cotton here is that we are looking, both sides of the fabric are the same, so it's hard to keep straight which is which, but at the same time I also I can't get confused because both sides function equally well when setting them together. But I will match up my notches here, kind of above the bust. And there are a couple of curves in this area, so I might have to pre-clip the fabric just because of the radicalness of the concave to convex situation going on. So I'll just pre-clip this seam a little bit. I don't want to clip the full 1/2 inch of seam allowance, but maybe like 1/4 inch to 3/8, just to help me get this line to lay in here smooth. And I will pin all the smooth stuff first from the neckline down to the bust, and then from the side seam towards the bust. And then whatever's left over is what I need to gather down into place. And I do just want to make sure that my gathering is evenly distributed along this under bust zone so that I don't have too much gathering sitting in one place and not the other, just trying to distribute the extra fabric evenly. And I will of course pin the other side in the exact same way, pinning the smooth sections first and then gathering everything down to fit in between. And I'll just mention while working on a gathered design like this, if for example you have less than 30 degrees of dart fullness, if you do not have a ton of dart degree to work with when creating gathering, you can always add additional fullness for style reasons as opposed to for fit reasons. So I'm using all 52 degrees of my fit fullness here to show you what it looks like with just fit fullness. But if you desired more gathering than this, you can always add in additional flare. And I have made a video before all about gathered designs where I show how to add that additional fullness in, so I will put a card up to that video as well. Sorry if my voice is a bit gravelly today. I haven't used it much recently. I'll be honest, the past couple of days I haven't had to talk much. Mostly I only ever get to talk to my cats, but winter is particularly isolating because I don't feel like leaving the house to even go to the grocery store, let alone anything else. But I will switch back to my normal 12 stitches per inch over here on the Singer 99K. That's the machine I use, by the way, for those who are new around here. This is a Singer 99K machine from 1955. And mine does have an electric motor, a Bakelite foot pedal, and actually a reverse stitch for this model, which is nice. Not all of these older models have the reverse stitch on them. But if you're ever wondering about my recommendations for sewing machines, I always say go used, and the more metal parts you can get in a machine, the better. This machine cost me $75 via Craigslist and has been my workhorse ever since I picked it up back in 2020. And I am just using 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual, trying to remember to remove my pins as I go. I'm sort of known for not doing so, but I've changed my ways because I got tired of seeing that comment. Mostly. And also because I work with so many Lurex fabrics that do dull the needle so quickly that I don't need anything else dulling my needle at that point. I do also switch my needle on my machine quite often. That's another tip that I feel like I don't hear often enough. Needles are not that expensive per needle, and if you're not sewing as much as I am, then this would certainly not be an expense, but switch your needle after every big project, especially if you're working with a delicate fabric or something that would dull it, like, say, a Lurex fabric. Because Lurex is just plastic. Like most polyesters, but even more so than most polyesters. But I've put some clips into the curves and went ahead and pressed that seam. And now I'm going to actually do a little bit of top stitching to keep the seam allowance pointed towards the center here. Just felt like that would be a nice, smooth, clean finish for this, and also help contain some of that seam allowance if you weren't going to line something like this, which obviously I'm not lining the mock-up today, but if you're making this into a dress, it might be a nice way to finish this. And you could always use decorative stitching or embroidery of some kind as well, if doing this for something fancy. But now the front is constructed and the backs are constructed, I can go ahead and line up things along the side and shoulder seams, finish up this mock-up. I still have to attach the facing along the front neckline and opening as well. Luckily this will be an easier muslin for me to pin on because I don't have to try and pin it behind my back because it has a center front opening, which is useful because the other two I'll be getting into today, I did have to try and pin them as much as possible behind my neck and behind my back. Because for some reason Oliver, Sophie, and Xander all simply refused to help me get in and out of mock-ups, which is just cruel, honestly. But I will line up my facing along the outside of this, right sides together. This is about a 2.5 inch wide facing at the center fronts, but then it extends to about 3, even 3.5 at the center back. And this neckline stands away from my neck about a 1/2 inch, whereas I think hers goes right next to the neck, which is nice in theory, but I always find that if you're wearing makeup and it's like blended down onto your neck, it's kind of better if your neckline doesn't exactly touch your neck, unless you want to wash your garment all the time, which if you made this out of a, say, washable Kona cotton, wouldn't be a problem, but if you're making this out of, I don't know, fancy wool, then it might be an issue. And that is the kind of thing I like to think about because I don't like doing laundry or figuring out laundry solutions. So if I can make a small adjustment to a design that means I won't get makeup on the collar, I'll do it. I often get questions about how I deal with having fancier fabrics in my wardrobe, and the answer is I try and make sure the garments don't get dirty, either from me and my makeup or my body by wearing things underneath the garment. So I'll wear thin little undershirts under things as often as I can, which is again part of the reason I don't really wear sleeveless things. It's because I like to be able to wear little tiny thin Uniqlo, actually brand, shirts underneath things, so that just like a lady in the Victorian or Georgian past, I can wash my undershirt, aka shift, as opposed to the outer garment, so I can wear things several times before I have to worry about getting it dry cleaned or hand washing it or going through any of that rigmarole. Of course, the other consideration there is to not sit in any mud or anything, which hopefully can be avoided. If you're going to like a raspberry jam festival, perhaps wear something washable. But I will clip all of my curves, fold my facing to the inside. Of course, this edge would need to be finished in some way if you were making a finished garment. Using a facing like this, I just went ahead and top stitched the very edge of this after I had it pressed, so things don't roll around too much as I try and pin this on to be able to model this design for you. And here I have this mock-up pinned on while wearing a pencil skirt here. And you can see that there's a couple of drag lines across the shoulder area. That's mostly because this block is meant to have a sleeve set into it, so those would mostly disappear once the sleeve was in there. But of course I'm a moving, breathing, cookie-eating human being, so things fit me a little bit differently. And I do think that this 30s design, they would have kept a little bit more ease through the center than I have, certainly inherent in my block pattern and that I usually use for my own garments. So I'm kind of wearing the more 50s version of this, although anything from the 1930s looks more 40s or 50s once I put it onto my body. Just because of my personal proportions, I am not a gamine creature. Now the next style I want to demonstrate is something asymmetric and something where I will have to draft a full front of the bodice block. This late 1940s design has a little bit of a shoulder yoke with some gathering thrown up into that. It does seem like quite a lot of gathering for only one dart worth of fullness, which is what they are using here. And I will explain both what they did to achieve this kind of smoother fronted version and then talk you through what I did to go ahead and eliminate the side darts on both sides of the garment as well. But you can see here from the back of the envelope, they have left the side dart on the smooth side, and they have used the side dart fullness to create the gathering up into the yoke on the side with the yoke. But personally, the extra asymmetry of having that little side dart chilling on the smooth side just bothers me here for some reason. So I'll show you how I personally would do up this design by eliminating that side dart into the gathering as well. And I will make sure that I draw my dart legs all the way to the apex so that I can use them for dart manipulation. Again, you'll want to set that back once you start to sew darts, but when you are designing with dart fullness, you want to make sure that those dart legs go all the way up to the apex to facilitate the rotation of it all. And as you can see, the inspector is back on duty and requiring loveys, unfortunately. Go ahead and draw in that little curved shoulder yoke here. And then if you wanted to keep all 4 of these darts, you could technically just draw in drag lines to the waist from that shoulder yoke and open these up and add in fullness just along the center of the garment. If you wanted to keep your darts right where they were, for some reason, I don't know why. If you wanted there to be lots of darts, if you want to practice sewing your darts and you wanted to have to make 4 of them on the front of this, you could cut away the yoke here, add seam allowance to both sides, in my case, unless you're one of those non-seam allowance people, which, good for you being able to remember to put seam allowance when you're cutting things out. I am just not that person. I would forget every time. But then you could just cut down these lines here. This would be adding the gathering in for just style reasons and not to help with fit in any way. And you could gather that down into the shoulder while keeping your darts right where they are. But with a design like this one, it's important to note that you can use dart fullness to make this design. And that is what they've done. They've closed this first dart on the left-hand side of the screen here. So you can draw a line from the apex up into the shoulder, and I'm going to do that on both sides. Even though they've only eliminated the first side over here, I'm going to do both the left and the right up into the shoulder here. So again, in the retro design, they have just closed this first dart on the left-hand side of the screen. They've done this like so, tape this into place, and they've used that gathering as the gathering into the yoke. But I want more gathering, and more so I just want to be able to close this dart, because having a side dart on one side but not the other, for some reason just bothers me. Whereas having the asymmetric gathering doesn't bother me at all. I like that. Having a dart that is asymmetric, I don't know why it bothers me, it just does. But technically you could just close that first one, and that would be how to create this retro design as it was made in the past. But I'm doing my version here today, where both side darts are closed up into that same section of asymmetric gathering on the shoulder. And I have shown designs like this before. Usually I'll close all of the darts up into here, because you can. So I will actually, again, link in the description below. I have done an example similar to this before, where I close all of the dart fullness into gathering, because you do not actually have to have waist darts when doing this design any longer either. You could, all of the gathering up in here could be just via the fit fullness. But obviously they're leaving some of the fit fullness in these waist darts, so I will redraw in my dart points here. And I actually think when I do a waist dart, for me personally, in my bust shape and the bra I wear, I think I could actually move these closer to the apex. This is 1 1/4 inch away, and I think I actually need to leave this at 1 inch away. We're always learning and adjusting these things, you know? And cut this out of a single layer of our same dull blue cotton here. I will of course need to mark my darts on here, and then all the area to be gathered down up here in the shoulder, which now that I'm looking at it does look very distorted and strange. But of course that all fits back down and creates the same cone as it ever would. Just using some tailoring chalk here to draw in my darts. My waist darts are pretty large all on their own, and this is only half of my dart fullness. So again, there are certain designs that work better when you have a lot of dart fullness inherent in the pattern to work with, and there are certain designs that work much better when you have a lower degree of dart fullness. Every proportion of party hat comes with its own pros and cons when it comes to pattern manipulation. And I did cut out a little neckline facing for this, just to be able to finish it off, and again, give a finished look to our muslin later, so you can get a full idea of what the style would begin to look like. And I cut out some backs as well, and Oliver just needs to be hugged. Clearly, the assistant was here to be hugged as opposed to help out in any way. Although I guess affection is help of its own kind. But I'll go ahead and sew my waist dart, starting at the large end of the dart, sewing off the tip, and just kind of curving that last little bit, a little tiny bit, using a very small stitch length for this, 12 or even 15 stitches per inch, especially at the end of the dart there. Though again, as I mentioned in the last video, getting your dart points perfect in something like a quilting cotton is a little bit more annoying. And the standard like waist dart I have sitting on my block pattern is probably around 30 degrees of my fullness, which I would say is edging towards the max size for easily sewing a perfectly smooth dart. About 30 degrees and up is where you really have to start babying a dart to get it to lie perfectly smooth. But I will use my tailor's ham to press those darts towards the center front. That is another question and or complaint I often get, is which way to press your darts, or that I do it wrong, or that you were taught differently. For vertical darts and seams, I always press things towards the center front. And then for horizontal darts, I press those down. That is just how I was taught. And you'll notice that's the instruction that is given in the Helen Joseph Armstrong book. And that was the book I was taught with during university. So that is why I do what I do. I think it's more important that you keep your pressing consistent, especially like within one project, as opposed to having one set of rules over another. All right, and I do have my gathering stitching up here, so I will go ahead and tie off one side of that so I can gather all of this down into our little shoulder yoke piece. And again, how much gathering you want to try and shove into a small shoulder yoke piece like this will depend on what fabric you're using. So if I was using a thick wool coating, getting all this, I would have to cartridge pleat it to get it to actually go down this small. So the thinner and lighter weight of a fabric you're using, the easier it's going to be to gather a bunch down into one little spot. But I will pin this into place. Take this back over the machine and stitch the gathering to the yoke, remaking our cone here, seeing as we are using fit fullness for this. None of this is extra style fullness in my case. This is probably a good 50 degrees of dart fullness that I'm sticking up into the shoulder, just because we're using a 22 degree dart from either side of the bodice. So one party hat, per side of the bust, and each is 52 degrees in my instance. So when I start doing asymmetric designs, the dart fullness goes above 52 degrees, it becomes 104. To put 104 degrees of fullness into one area, that would be a lot of gathering. You would need a nice lightweight chiffon or georgette, or maybe a cotton voile, but probably not a poplin even, to put all of my dart fullness from both sides all into one asymmetric bit. Hopefully you're following along with what I mean there. Some of you are. I don't know really where to place myself, whether or not I'm good for beginners or not, honestly. I do like the idea of the people who come in and say, hey, I've never done any of this before, so I might as well just jump in on the deep end. I'm like, thank you. That's the kind of swimmers I need in my classes. All right, I went ahead and stitched on my facing so we can see what this would look like with a slightly finished neckline, even if the arm sides are going to be in the raw like this. And I will try and pin this on up my back as much as I can. If it doesn't look like it fits perfectly, do remember that I'm trying to pin behind me. But you can see the gathering on mine pulls much more from that other bust, unlike this example, because hers only has the dart fullness from the one side dart, and mine has the dart fullness from both side darts. So I do have those pull lines coming from the other apex as well, as opposed to the original retro design, which does have the pull lines only coming from the one apex, because they're only using dart fullness from that one side. But the general idea and method of manipulation is the same, and the differences all boil down to how much dart fullness from each side of the garment you want to throw into an asymmetric detail like this one. And as you can see, the entire back of this is open because I cannot reach it myself. Sadly, I'm just not that flexible. But hopefully you can get a general idea of how this sort of design would go together and look when used for a garment. And the last option for using dart degree fullness I wanted to go over today was using dart fullness to create parallel darts or parallel tucks. And I did touch on this briefly in the last video, but I wanted to go over it in a little bit more detail because I know a lot of you are mimicking 1930s, 40s, and 50s designs like I am, and may see this detail pop up and want to know how to mimic it. But the dart degree fullness has been split into several tucks that are parallel with one another as opposed to pointing towards the apex directly. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm going to close one dart, the side dart in this case, into a side French dart. Sometimes they use a French dart to mean just this angled dart like this. Sometimes a French dart means like this, but curved instead. And I mean curved visually, not curved for fit reasons. And in one of my books, it's even called like a French bodice, and they're talking about princess seams instead. Like when you're using style lines, they call it a French bodice. And I was like, we need to stop it with labeling things as French, especially when it's just going to get this confused. Anyhow, I'll fold that closed and cut off the excess. And this dart is so close to the waistline that it almost does start to interact with things, and this would be a bit bulky down here. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the dart fullness out of this dart. You can always do this. You still sew it and treat it like a dart, but you just trim off the excess. Works especially well when maybe using a bulky or sheer fabric even. If you wanted to keep things a little bit cleaner, I'll cut out the excess from inside the dart and we'll still sew it as normal later on. Now it looks to me like these tucks are kind of parallel with the shoulder seams. That was what I was trying to keep in mind here when I drew these in. extending them down to within 1.5 inches of the apex zone. And this was when I realized I had only drawn in 3 of these when I needed there to be 4, so I have to switch markers and draw them in again. Stay with me. I had originally drawn these 5/8 of an inch apart, and I actually needed them to be very small, only a 1/2 inch apart. I'm going to extend the ends of these down to the apex, so we have our angled lines that we would normally need for fit reasons from the ends of these parallel lines towards the apex. And I can cut down each of these to the apex itself, and we will split my waist dart fullness up here, which is of course about half of my 52 degrees, a little over. For whatever reason, I have more chilling in the waist dart on my block than I do in the side. It would make sense to have it perfectly evenly split, but past me didn't even ever bother measuring these things, you know? Now I have a new way of talking about this because I have measured that dart degree fullness, but again, you don't have to know what the degree is in order to do any of this because I've been working without knowing for a very long time. Anyway, the idea up here would be to distribute these perfectly evenly, by the way. I don't think I measure it, but the idea would be to have these perfectly equidistant. Well, maybe I do measure it. Good job, past me. It was over a week ago, I can't remember. Oh no, see, I thought about it, and then I was like, nah, I'm eyeballing that. Most of the time I eyeball things, especially for a mock-up like this. But I'll go ahead and split that. Now, of course, we're not going to sew all the way down towards the apex here. These look like they're maybe 3 or 4 inches long tucks at most. So I'm going to grab a marker here. In my case, a Sharpie. Once I've started using tape, I like to mark things with Sharpie instead of my washable markers because it will draw over the tape as well. Whereas my washable markers, that's a one-way ticket to having marker all over my hands once I start drawing indications over tape where it just slides right off. But I'll need to fold all these shut. It looks like they have the fullness tucked in towards the neckline, and so that the tucks open up towards the shoulder. So that's how I'm folding my little pleats here as well. I'm just taping those shut as I go. As you can see, this leaves the dart fullness kind of free and open over the bust, but that's okay because it's a looser design. These are tucks, not darts. You do have to get quite close to the apex like this if you're going to do parallel darts though, because again, you are going to be leaving a little bit of extra fullness in over the kind of apex zone itself, and that's just a compromise you have to make if you want your parallel darts. It will probably create and leave a little bit more ease over the exact apex itself because you don't have them pointed directly towards the apex. You're creating fullness in an area outside naturally should be for fit reasons, which again is a decision you can make for design reasons. There are always compromises between fit and design. But I will go ahead and mark my tucks and my darts on this piece here, which you can see I cut out along the fold, just using a colored pencil here to mark in the ends of the darts. And my dart point for this French dart. Angled side dart. And again, if you struggle with getting your dart points perfectly smooth, sometimes you can just switch to a tuck instead. And of course that leaves the design a little bit different, but it's just another way to control fit fullness without having to sew the dart point itself. You don't actually have to use darts as darts, if you know what I mean. Which at this point in the video, I really hope so. But yes, on these cutaway darts, I'm still marking the dart legs, and I'm just going to sew these same as I ever would, just the triangle of the dart is already cut away, which is fine, but I'll just pinch and pin them like any other dart, and kind of ignore the fact that some of it is missing. And again, Oliver is getting involved. He was very involved with the, cutting and pinning process of this. Luckily, he kind of let me get my pattern work done, but then he showed up for the actual sewing session. And just sewing each of those angled side darts here and tying my darts closed. Again, just how I was taught in fashion school to finish a dart, and thus I've stuck with it. Although again, I attended several different schools, and they all had their own rules and methods, ways of teaching things, which was a bit confusing for me because you get points marked off in school for sewing something in a different way than they teach you, even though you may get the same result. So a lot of the things I consider rules in my sewing practice are just because they were drilled into me and I didn't want to get marks off my grade, That doesn't mean another way doesn't work, it just means that it wasn't the way my professor wanted me to do it at the time. And I will go ahead and pin my tucks here. I'm just making sure that those parallel lines are lined up in a parallel fashion here, using my pins to stick through the beginning and end of each of these tucks to keep them aligned, like so. Of course, you don't want to get these things twisted at all, because the grain line of the fabric would then twist a bit, and you might be able to see that in the finished garment. I'm just starting at the end of the tuck here, kind of the opposite of how I sew a dart. That's because I can do backstitching at the beginning and end of a tuck, because it is just a straight little pleat, as it were. And while the lines that we have drawn in and the lines that we are sewing are parallel, the part of the tuck that gets tucked away does narrow a little bit as it nears the bust. Because there is fit happening within the excess of the tuck, just as there would be in a dart. Whenever you're sewing a tuck for fit like this, you basically are just sewing half of a dart or a quarter of a dart, however long your tucks are. What differentiates them from the dart itself is just that you have backed off that point. And of course I have 4 tucks to sew on each shoulder here, so I did this in stages. I pinned 2 on each shoulder to begin with, and then I came back over here to the ironing board, gave these a little bit of a press as I was working, and then of course after I had all 4 on each shoulder sewn, I could go ahead and press the extra fullness towards the neckline, just like the retro illustration indicated for me, like so. Of course you could top stitch these or edge stitch them on the outside as well, which is something you sometimes see done. Depends on the design you have in mind. And again, so that I could model this for you, I have some basic block backs and a little neckline facing to throw onto here to finish off this mock-up and make it wearable, or at least so that you can have an idea of what these sort of modifications look like on a person. But here are my tucks, look quite a lot like the image here. And here are my side darts. Of course, everything about this would fit even better if I had a zipper up the back of this instead of 3 pins. So you'll just have to trust me. Believe me, I would never try and lead you astray. I just want everyone to be able to use their dart fullness in whatever which way they wish. I hope you were able to follow along with these 3 different examples today and that you found this video helpful. And while the YouTube comment section really does not like a hyperlink, feel free to leave suggestions for designs you'd like to see me demonstrate in the comments below, either a vintage pattern number or a pattern number for any modern design as well, descriptions of things, just as long as you can leave me some sort of a detailed paper trail to follow. Hopefully I'll be able to find an image of what you are after. It's really hard without being able to link like that, but actually you can DM me on Instagram as well if you want to DM me a snap of the kind of design you're after. Because while my intention is to train you up to be able to do the same sort of design investigation upon seeing any style, I know we're not all there yet, so I still have plenty to demonstrate for all of you to get you up to this level of X-ray vision. In any case, thank you as always for watching today, and a huge thank you to my patrons who make my work and these videos possible. And if you're interested in seeing more pattern drafting demonstrations and sewing project videos from me, those can be found over on Patreon. And as always, I'll be back drafting dangerously with you here real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.